See, everybody can be a genius when everything goes right. If you can be a genius when everything's going wrong and the universe isn't conspiring on your behalf, you have an edge up in the world in terms of the quality of life you live and what you can bring to others that's incomparable to almost anything else I can imagine.
Cheers, existence. Welcome, Dr. Joseph Riggio. So happy that you've come back again to our ontological ice cave. And we have had several previous conversations, which we'll put in links in the channel. The first one, we spoke of your personal hero's journey and life story. In the second one, we drilled into stories of your relationship to your master, your personal Obi-Wan Kenobi, a man named Roy Frazier. And you described that in the 7 years of studying with Roy, you learned the ins and outs of his approach, which he called the generative imprint. Today, we wanted to spend a little time discussing how Roy's generative imprint evolved within you and transmuted into your own model, which is deeply tied, I believe, to Joseph Campbell. So if you wouldn't mind, perhaps you could place us first in sort of the map of you, Joseph Campbell, Roy Frazier, in sort of where we are in your timeline with those people and those influences.
Okay. So I think the place to go to is that in the late 1980s, I'm working with Roy and I'm learning with Roy. And in the process of doing this, I had already been familiar with Joseph Campbell's work. And I'm hearing an overlap in Joe Campbell's model of mythological framing and what Roy's doing. And I'm recognizing that they're at least kind of doing some of the same things. So I continue to listen. And somewhere in that first year of learning with Roy, he mentioned Joseph Campbell. And in doing that, I recognized kind of an alignment between what he was saying, Roy, and what Joseph Campbell had written about and what I was studying. And I was very familiar with and really excited about mythological models. So fast forward to the mid-1990s, 93-ish, something like that. And I began to get the idea of modifying the model a little bit. And the way that I modified the model was to begin to emphasize the idea of narrative. And there were two reasons I did this. At that point, what I was learning with Roy, I pretty much had a really profound grasp of. I was in there for 4 or 5 years. I was beginning to think about what I wanted to do and how I was moving forward. I had been doing NLP facilitator and master practitioner trainings and running those, which were year-long programs with clients. I was doing one-to-one work with clients. I was doing some corporate work. So there's a lot of stuff going on already at this point. And more, the idea of the narrative was grabbing my attention, how people live inside of and in relation to their narratives, their myths, right? And I coined this idea that I referred to as the Mythogenic Self Process. And I designed a particular process, which was based, frankly, on the generative imprint work, on Roy's model, but was introducing two things. Number one, what I thought of as very profound and significant impact of the social conditioning process, being in a group, being in relation to others, and having relationships. And that was not a particularly poignant part of Roy's work. Roy was very, very focused on the individual, and his work was brilliant in every regard in that, domain, that area of consideration. But as soon as you extended it out into group thinking, group process, social sphere, it was just less present. Less of that was in the model. And I was really interested in that. I was very interested in the group process for a whole number of reasons. And in addition, I really was fascinated by the idea of the somatic embodied process. So the way that the body fed back to what we could call the mind, the inputs of the environment that you're in, the sensory inputs. And so that became part of the Mythogenic Self model as well. And slowly, over time, not in 93 or 94, but by 99, the models had diverged enough that I began calling the Mythogenic Self Process a model of its own. I referred to it as the MythoSelf Process, and I began teaching other people in a training format to use this model distinctly, the MythoSelf model, as a distinct and complete model of its own with people, and I certified them as facilitators and master facilitators to be able to do this work. And That to some extent was also a bit of a shift away from NLP, which I had done a lot of study in, and obviously at that point had been already a trainer. And that was the idea that rather than doing work with people as a practitioner or as a coach or as a consultant or any of these other words, the MythoSelf process is about facilitating someone to come to a particular awareness, which is this mythological form that they operate in relation to and inside of. So that was why I called them facilitators and master facilitators when I was certifying. So I think that kind of gives us a sense of timeline. 88, 89, learning with Roy. 93, 94, the beginning of my moving away into the MythoSelf process. And by 99, pretty much a complete setting of myself inside of a framework that was distinct, and I began using from that point forward almost exclusively.
Okay, great. Thank you. And could you re-emphasize where Joseph Campbell shows up in your timeline? It sounded like you were already familiar with him, then you were studying with Roy, and then you were sort of reconnecting with Campbell as you developed your own model. Is that correct?
Well, I first came in touch with Campbell, became aware of Joe Campbell way back in the late 1970s, because there was a lot of talk around Joseph Campbell when he worked with George Lucas on the Star Wars project. So it came to my awareness. I was a huge Star Wars fan. I thought it was a brilliant piece of fantasy and mythology and perfect for the times. And of course, it blew away pretty much everything that was happening at the time in terms of the blockbuster level at which it appeared. So it caught my attention like everybody else's attention. And from that, it led me to Joseph Campbell and his work. And I began to read Joseph Campbell's work. I read The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I began looking at the way that a lot of script writers were using Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model. And so I just became intrigued and began to study and listen to Joe Campbell's tapes and read his books. And so that was really the beginning point, the late 1970s. In 1986, I actually began playing with the hero's journey as a kind of idea of doing work with clients I'd begun working with as early as then.
Okay, wonderful. So can you take us a little deeper into the MythoSelf model?
Sure. So as I said, I'll give you a kind of little origin story about the MythoSelf model. And the real origin story goes like this. I was invited to a conference in 1994, and I was invited to give a presentation it was an NLP conference, the American NLP Association. And I was invited to give a conference there, to give a speech rather in the conference. And when I did that, I had to have a title, right? And I had to have something I was going to talk about. And I decided that I would present this idea of a highly oriented, positively based model. You could say the generative imprint model, Roy's model. But I didn't want to present the generative imprint model. Number one, I didn't think it was my material to do. And in talking with Roy, we agreed that it wasn't necessarily the best way for me to approach things, both from my servicing myself as well as being honorable and credible for Roy. It was his model, not my model. And the second thing is that there was someone else who he had been working with who had been presenting the model publicly, and we didn't want to kind of step on her toes at all. So I began to think about what do I want to present, because I am going to include, by default, a lot of what I learned with Roy. There was no possibility after 6 years of apprenticing with him that I wasn't going to include some of his material and a lot of his material. And I began to think about what the distinctions were that I wanted to point out, which were not pure generative imprint distinctions. And I began to recognize when I used the model, always had been referring to it for the last 3 or 4 years in reference to moving through the hero's journey as Joseph Campbell had laid it out. So I had actually diagrammed it. I diagrammed the idea of meeting the mentor or the guide. I diagrammed crossing the threshold and what those steps looked like, what it meant to get in touch with the threshold guardians on the other side that would push you back, how that showed up after the fact as magic helpers. I began to look at the idea of moving towards getting the gift or the boon and facing yourself in the cave or in the belly of the whale, as Joe Campbell puts it sometimes, receiving the boon or the gift and crossing the threshold back into ordinary society. This movement, which is a psychological movement, a movement of the psyche, not a movement of the individual, was something that had intrigued me because I recognized Joe Campbell, not only in terms of laying it out absolutely, had described something that seemed evident and obvious in terms of the clients I was working with. They all went through their hero's journey, and they were at some point in it when they and I met, when we began doing our work together. And if I could identify that, I became much more effective and efficient at doing it. So I designed a presentation about the MythoSelf process, which was then defined for me as the kind of overlap between Roy's model and Joseph Campbell's model and the way I was applying it. And in that conference, I delivered that presentation and got great reviews from it. I made a lot of contacts in the NLP world. And I began to get invited to do this work with the clients of other NLP trainers because of what they'd heard me say in that conference. And I continued to deliver at different conferences that were typically annual. Every year or so, I would run and deliver a program, sometimes twice a year. And my reputation began to build as somebody who could do really profound transformational work. And in my mind, it was because of the model I was using. This MythoSelf model was uniquely designed to produce transformational change. And as I did that, of course, and worked with more people and more groups, my skills and my effectiveness increased, and I continued to refine the model. So that was the real origin, was the 1994 International Association of NLP in Phoenix, Arizona. That's where it was held. So that's what went on. Then I went to a couple of other, as I said, conferences, a couple in Massachusetts and California. Overseas, I was invited to present in England. And so it just allowed me the real opportunity to be in front of a lot of different audiences, trying material out and noticing what was working when I was presenting to other professionals who were doing the same kind of work I was doing, and get their response and their feedback. And that allowed me to kind of pare away the stuff that was less than useful and to introduce other concepts that were not present originally that made it more powerful, more effective, more efficient to do this work with people. And by 1999, as I said, I felt I had a very solid, freestanding, a contained model, a model that was on its own very powerfully organized and could stand alone. And therefore, I began to design the trainer's training. And the trainer's training was debuted in 1999 with a group of people who had been through MythoSelf, what I call the MythoSelf experience programs. They were 3-day programs for personal transformational change. And I invited some of the people who have been through those programs who were also doing coaching and consulting and doing counseling work to come and learn with me this MythoSelf process. And that first group was incredibly enthusiastic. I'm in touch with almost every one of them. And the reason I say almost every one, there are actually one or two that passed away. Other than that, I'm in touch with all of them. And we have a very good relationship in general and have a very strong idea of holding in place the concepts and refining them.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Would you be willing to delve a little bit into the MythoSelf model and share more about that with us?
I'm going to take a high road first, and if you want me to go deeper into specifics, I'm happy to. But the high road is simply this. The way that humans make sense of the world and the MythoSelf model, the learning that I started in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was clearly based on what we can call cognitive science or neurocognitive science, even though I didn't necessarily think of it particularly at the first encounter. By 1990, I had thought that. In fact, I entered into a master's program and took some courses at the master's level in cognitive science because I recognized the value of it. And so the essential idea that came out of all this for me, and I've been studying now neuroscience and neurocognitive science for 30 years, reading every major paper that I could get my hands on, studying the actual neurological process, looking at the cognitive process very, very deeply, things like philosophy of mind and such. And every time I wind up getting into that and exiting back out, what it brings forth for me is the realization that the way we think, the way humans are organized to think, is inside of narratives, stories. So no matter what goes on, we make up a story about it. And we all believe, of course, that the story we're making up is what actually happened, that is the experience. It's one of the reasons I'm going to argue that stories that are purely made up, the fantasy writer who writes about the dinosaur culture on planet Zatar can grab our attention because the structure of what that fantasy writer is doing matches the way we think. even though we'd all, generally speaking, I'm sure there's some people out there who think that there are dinosaurs who run the culture and are the highest form of life on the planet Zatar. But most of us recognize this is a fantasy. It's a story that relates back to things we can identify. The fact that there is a ruling class of species on the planet, that there is a political governmental structure in place, that these individuals of the species have interactions with each other. All of that's familiar. And if you keep that as the fundamental structure of the narrative, it's very easy for people to make sense of the narrative because that's how our brains work. So that was what I came to very early on in the development of the model, is that mythology is a particular way of approaching narrative. And that Joseph Campbell in particular had broken apart, had dissected mythology as an idea, as a topic, in relation to the transformation of the individual and what I would call the movement to maturity. So we all go through kind of a mini hero's journey every few years as children. We come to know ourselves as different people. And then as adults, it kind of slows down in the sense that the cycles might still be recursive and happening over and over again, but instead of taking 6 months or a year, they might take 10 years or 20 years before we go through a whole cycle. And we look at these critical junctures that cause us to enter into and move through different moments in the cycle, but you can map almost absolutely where a person is at any moment in their life to where they are as described by Joseph Campbell in the hero's journey cycle. So that's what became so fascinating to me and where I began to produce what I'm going to call refinements of the way I use the model. And so it's really about bringing a person to an awareness of the mythology they're living inside of at the moment, how that mythology creates a frame of reference from which they make sense of everything they call real based on, and what it is that limits them inside the model as well from getting other things that seem to be unavailable to them within the mythology that they're holding on to. And then, as you know about any good story, in any good story, there are stories within the story, within the story, within the story. So, one of the famous stories out there in the land of fantasy is J.R.R. Tolkien's the Lord of the Rings cycle. And inside that story, there's the story of the ring. There's the story of the evil forces. There's the story of the good forces. There's the human story, the hobbit story, the elf story, the orc story. And there's stories of the individual characters in relation to one another. There's Gandalf's story and Fodor's story, and we can go on and on. Sam's story, right? Even Schmeagol has a story, right? So each of these characters has stories, and they're contained within other stories, which are contained within other stories, and the dwarves and so on. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so as we look at this and we make sense of it through time, what we can say is that in our lives, we can understand where we are in relation to anything or anyone as the way that the story of that relationship, whether it's a relationship to a thing, to an activity, to a person, to an experience, to our sense of self, can be formed into a narrative, a myth, a story. And that there's what Joseph refers to as the monomyth, the overall arching myth at the very top of things that contains all those sub-stories. The Lord of the Rings, containing all the stories of all the characters I just walked through very quickly.
To make it a little bit more understandable, can we wrap it in the context of a story? For instance, would you have someone that you'd worked with that you could share their process anonymously, that how you took them through the MythoSelf process?
Well, the MythoSelf process is itself a contained process. The MythoSelf process spawns, if you want to call it that, an innumerable number of applications depending on the facilitator or the trainer who's using it. So the fundamental process always begins with the idea of identifying what a person wants and how they want it. We start with this very simple question all the time, which is, what do you want? Now, here's the magic I learned from Roy, and I really have to pat him on the back and give him credit for it, is that in the moment you ask that particular question, when a person is capable of answering it, they can really get to what they want. They embody, in that moment of answering it, the form they hold when they have it. So I have someone who walks in and they're going through a struggle in their life. And the struggle in their life is that they don't know where they are. They don't have a real sense and grounding in their identity. And this manifests as a kind of rage or anger against the world. They're raging against life in a way because they feel unsettled. And when he came to me, he was a young man. He was in his early 20s. And one of the things that became very obvious is his mechanism for dealing with the world was anger. And he was very, very open to getting help. He sought out help. He'd seen a lot of people. He worked with a lot of people. He'd been with a number of NLP trainers prior to meeting me, and was introduced to me, in fact, by an NLP trainer. And when we met, I recognized this profound anger. So when this person came to me, I identified very early on that he was using the mechanism of anger to deal with the world. As things came up, this is what he did. And even though he was very open to receiving input, he had worked with a lot of people, a lot of NLP trainers, and in fact, it was an NLP trainer who introduced him to me. I could see this mechanism in play. And he was very sensitive. So anger, in this particular case, was a response to hurt or disappointment or sadness. And rather than expressing the varied emotions that could be in place at any moment for him, they all just jumbled down and defaulted into just this kind of raging against the world and himself. And that's the first step, is recognizing, in a way, how a person is limited in what they want. And of course, in his case, what he wants is to be happy and to be free, to have a sense of independence. So I asked him a question, and this is where kind of the skill comes in. You can't really put this into a workbook and say, okay, now you're at step 4, ask this question this way. You have to have a sensitivity for it. You have to build the awareness of how people operate. And I said to him, so tell me who it is you know you still love. And in that moment, these were mutually exclusive things. He couldn't have rage and love at the same time. Now, he could have rage and love, and he could even have rage and love for the same person. He could even have rage and love in the same experiential way, but not at the same time. So he had to kind of let go in order to be able to answer the question. What I said is, to answer the question, what do you want, requires an ableness of sorts. And he was able to find that and identify this sense of someone he felt a true and profound love for. In his particular case, it happened to be a grandfather of his on one side of the family. And this grandfather represented a kind of ideal. The grandfather was, in fact, for him, mythological. In other words, what I mean by that is his story of his grandfather was more pure, more perfect than his grandfather was. Because no one is pure. No one is perfect. And when you hear a story that someone tells about someone who's perfect and pure, you know they're holding a mythological form. They're holding a story about, a narrative about that individual. And this is what he did. And that was great because it gave him a touch point that was, absolutely irrevocable, that he could count on at any given moment. And when I began to hear him talk about this, I began to elicit more about it. Tell me more, right? Give me more. And as he did that, he began to enter into the form, you could say, of being in relation to that pure idealized representation of his grandfather. And there was this sense of profound love there. And then, as we finished that little bit of the process, he was able to re-engage the kind of anger, the frustration, the sadness is what came up, actually, that wasn't what life was like for him. And immediately, almost, he begins to transition out of that sadness into this kind of rage, this anger. And he looked at me, I remember, very, very intensely, like, so do you think you can help me? And I went, I can tell you exactly what you need to hear if you want to hear it. Mm-hmm. But you have to decide if you want to hear it. And he said to me, he did. He wanted to hear it. And we were in a group of people. We were, and I said, do you want me to say it in front of everybody else or say it to you privately? He says, no, you can say it out loud. He was very, very bold about the whole thing at that moment. Mm-hmm. For most people, rage is emboldening. So what happened was I gave him his answer, which was that, he was drowning in a sea of anger, and it was pulling him in like quicksand. And as long as he tried to swim against it and fight his way out, it would pull even harder on him. And he would eventually sink and drown and be beneath it and find no way out, maybe permanently. The only way to get out was to let go completely. Now, here's what happens, is in that moment, I had already had the perfect form for him of this love that he represented as its alternative. I knew what it looked like for him. I knew what he did in his body. I knew what his voice sounded like. I knew the rhythm of his voice. I knew the kind of words he used. And I began to become that person for him. I spoke in that rhythm. I used those words. I used that tonality. Right? I, in fact, even took on some of the body characteristics of how he held his body, the drop of his shoulders, the expression on his face, the slackness and contractions in the muscles of the body, as much as I could. And he couldn't accept but to see in that moment a reflection of the possibility for himself of what it would be like to stop fighting. And that was the beginning of the work. And from there, the process is giving back to the person conscious and deliberate access to that way of being. Now, in the end, of course, this is what nobody really wants to hear, is it still remains a choice. Mm-hmm. In some ways, we are in fact creatures of free will. We are in fact creatures who have discretion. Mm-hmm. So a person can always choose to go back to what fails to serve them deliberately. And most people do, because it's conditioned, it's habitual, the external stimulus markers are all there for doing that instead of the thing that serves them and gives them that sense and that pathway to happiness and peace and calm and power that they want. And they have to learn to hold that. They have to become habitually conditioned in the other direction. So it's like somebody who's dieting and they want to change their lifestyle habits. You know, they don't want to eat cotton candy anymore. And when they walk past the cotton candy vendor, they have to make a choice to not buy cotton candy and eat it. It doesn't happen automatically. There is no magic pill, despite what everybody wants and assumes there would be. But as they can access, even for a moment, this alternative way of being in front of the cotton candy vendor, the cotton candy begins to lose its allure and its pull. And they can make it the 4 steps they need to take to be out of the range of that attraction. So that was actually someone that I became very close to and had a long, long relationship with.
Mm-hmm. So just to understand the process a little bit better, first you had him access this inspirational person that represented the love that was the polarity to the rage, or some transformational touch point against the rage. You helped him find that person, and then you actually became that person for him.
No.
Okay.
I became who he is when he's referencing that.
Okay, that's a really important distinction, and that's actually where I was going in my question. What I wanted to understand is in the process, are you actually taking him to the place of being what his grandfather represented to him?
I'm taking him to the place where when he thinks about what his grandfather represents, he becomes. So as we're in relation to the mythological form that represents for us, let's call it well-being for the moment.
Okay.
We experience a state of well-being. We don't experience what the thing that represents for us well-being is. We experience well-being. So what I have to represent is the way the person experiences well-being to and for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a portal. The grandfather was like a touch point or a portal to that facet of experience.
Right. So we can say, if we take it back to Joe Campbell's model, which might be interesting. Mm-hmm. We can say that, what happens at the beginning is that at the very top of the circle of the model, you could call it, there's the person living their life, and they're just in reality as they know it to be. Right? All its ups and downs and all its variance, they're all there. They're having good days and bad days and wonderful days and really lousy days. They're depressed and they're overjoyed and they're ecstasy and they're frustrated, and all those things happen because it's what it is to be human. And for most people, all of that happens on what I'm going to call a whim. They don't know how to control it. It's out of their control. It's raining, I feel bad. It's sunny, I feel good. Nobody calls me, I'm depressed. Somebody calls me, I'm overjoyed, right? It's all at a whim. Everything that happens is because, and this is the way it's held in the mind, something happens out in the world. So there's kind of an if-then potential. And for other people, there may be a slice of that. If we can, say there's a pie diagram, one of the slices of the pie is what happens internally for them, the way they are in that moment without, again, having any control over it. So if someone has a stomach aches, the world is miserable. I have a stomach ache. It's terrible. If I wake up and I feel full of energy, the world is wonderful. Everything is perfect, right? Again, not having control over the stomach ache or the sense of vitality that you experience, simply responding to it. And this is what I mean by being at cause of a whim, is that you're constantly in this responsive mode to things that you don't control or have any ability to modify. Well, the one thing everybody always has a choice about is how they respond to whatever comes up. Right? So person A looks out the window and they see it's raining, and what comes up for them is, oh my God, I'm going to be miserable, I'm going to get wet, I have to carry an umbrella, I hate carrying an umbrella. By the time I get to work, my shoes are going to be wet, I'm going to have to take an extra pair of shoes so I can take them off. Oh my God, it's dreary and there's no sun out, and right? That's what they say. Their next door neighbor, person B, looks out and goes, it's raining. Oh my God, it's raining. And it's April. And that means May flowers. So I'm so excited that it's raining because it's going to be a great April when all of the daffodils and crocus and tulips are coming up out of the ground. And I'm really going to love that because my yard is beautiful when the flowers are in bloom. And they see the flowers in the rain. You get it? So this is a choice. Theoretically, person B could have run out of sugar and knocks on the door of person A, who's having a miserable day because it's raining. And they walk in and they're ignorant, but their ignorance allows them to go, isn't it wonderful? It's raining. I just thought about all the flowers that are going to be in our backyard. We live next to each other in that yard, the building planted with all the tulips and the daffodils and the crocus. It's going to be up in a month. And this rain is really going to help, and it's going to be incredibly beautiful. And something triggers for person A in them that they actually love the flowers. And they never thought about the fact that if it wasn't raining, the flowers wouldn't come up. But now they are thinking about it. And all of a sudden, the rain is a little less depressing. Right? They didn't realize they had a choice. Mm-hmm. So they're still at the cause and effect mechanism of the whim of somebody else igniting for them a possibility that the rain isn't so terrible. But at least now it's shifted a little bit for them. Right? So that's where most people are at the top of the curve. They're living in this whim. The same way, by the way, person B is living in a whim, that the external event allows it to trigger in them the response they have about how wonderful it's going to be that it's raining. Right? Well, okay. Now let's move forward. As we move forward, we get into the next phase where there's an itch. That's the way I like to think of it. The itch is, it's got to be better than it is. There's got to be something more than what I'm experiencing. It can't be that I can only feel okay if the world is in my favor. So I do tell a story here, and it's my standard story, and I'll share it with you. And the story goes like this. A person wakes up in the morning, and they run a small office. And they've asked all the people who work for them, 9 people, to come in and be available for a meeting a half an hour before the day typically starts at 8:30. Their normal work day starts at 9. But they want to share some things, go over some reports, and get everybody ready for the upcoming month. So they've asked them to meet for this meeting before the day begins. And on this particular morning, they wake up, and the night before they spent hours putting all their plans together, and they have all the documents they need, and they had them printed so they could hand them out to the people who are coming next morning. And they're kind of excited about the meeting. And when they wake up, they remember all that. It's the first thing that happens. In addition to remembering all that, the next thing that happens for them is that they go ahead and recognize that it feels really nice to be in bed. And they're going to get up, and they're ready to go, and they throw their feet off the side of the bed. And it just so happens on that particular morning, because of the day it is, the sun is at exactly the right angle to have formed a puddle of sunlight just where their feet land at the side of the bed. And that sense of warmth and comfort just infuses them. And they think, it's going to be a nice day. Now they get up and they go into the shower, and it's just one of those days where you turn the shower knobs and they hit the right spot and the water's exactly the temperature you want it to be. And they got the radio playing in the bathroom, and their favorite songs, 3 of them in a row, come on. And they're like, damn, today is my day. It's not going to be a good day. It's going to be a great day. And they're doing well. When they get out of bed, get out of the shower, they look at the bed, and their partner's not there. And as they realize their partner's no longer in bed, they smell bacon, fresh toast, coffee, all those smells wafting up from the kitchen. And they realize their partner's gotten them up and has gone downstairs and prepared them a breakfast to get them ready for the day. And now they're feeling great love, and they remember the night before, just before they fell asleep, the two of them jostled a bit in bed, you know what I mean? That was good too. And all of a sudden, they're now downstairs, they're having breakfast, they're sharing their plans. It's early in the morning, they got up so they can get to the office an hour ahead of time, have everything prepared, make coffee, get everything laid out in the meeting room, have all the handouts in front of the chairs, everything is going to be wonderful. And they go, and they start their car, and it starts just like it should, and they pull out of the driveway, and they're on their way. They got a half-hour drive, everything's going according to plan. They, in that moment, are geniuses. Okay, that's the experience of genius. I am a genius. My life is perfect. And as they think that, they hear boom, boom. And what's happened is, somehow or another, they blew out 2 tires. They don't know it yet, but they know they blew out 1 because they can feel the flat. So they get out, and it's on the passenger side. And as they look, they realize that not just the front tire, but the back tire is also blown out. They drove over something which blew out both tires simultaneously. Now, this is bad because it means they're not going to get to work on time because they got to wait for somebody to come and tow them because you can't fix a tire and drive on 1 flat one and 1 good one. They don't have 2 spares. They're feeling a little less genius-like in the moment. And as they're walking around back to get in the car to make the phone call to the towing company that's going to help them out, the rain starts coming. Now they're standing there and they're wet from head to toe. It just comes down. And they're going, it goes from bad to worse. And they're feeling kind of miserable at this point, right? And they're thinking, it doesn't get worse than this. And as they think it doesn't get worse than this, a big old truck comes down the road. There's enough water in the road that there's a puddle. It splashes all over them. And not only are they wet, they're now covered in road grime and grease, and they look like hell. Their nice white shirt, that tie that they picked out to blend perfectly with the suit that day, it doesn't look like it did when they left the house. And now they're not just less than genius-like, they're really miserable and angry. Well, service truck comes, and they're getting pulled into the work. And there's 9 people now waiting for over an hour who got up early to get to work on time for their meeting that they called. And they know these people are not going to be happy. They know they're going to have to walk in the room, and no matter what's going on, no matter how bad they look and can explain away why they're late, those people have already been angry for an hour and upset with them, and they've got to deal with that. And the question is, in that moment, before they walk into the room, can they make the internal shift on their own to going back to that moment where their foot hit the floor and the puddle of light was there, and they knew it was going to be a great day? They felt like a genius. Because here's my argument. If somebody can do that, if somebody can walk into the room in that moment like a genius, the whole room changes. Everybody in that room no longer responds to the miserable, angry guy who got covered with road grime. They see somebody who seems unaffected by the fact that obviously something's gone wrong. And as soon as that person opens his mouth and says, I am so glad you guys are here. Thanks for waiting for me. I had a bit of trouble getting to work today. Let's get started. They don't need more than an explanation than that. They recognize this is somebody who dealt with whatever happened. They can see it on them, literally, but it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter to them and they went through it, how can it matter to me? And they take up everybody in the room. That's the purpose of doing MythoSelf work. That's the purpose, is to take back control of how you are in the world, the state of being you occupy at any given moment, despite what goes on in your life, despite the circumstances to the contrary. See, everybody can be a genius when everything goes right. If you can be a genius when everything's going wrong and the universe isn't conspiring on your behalf, you have an edge up in the world in terms of the quality of life you live and what you can bring to others that's incomparable to almost anything else I can imagine. And that's literally why I've designed what I did and have been doing what I do for the last 30 years, is to give people that edge where no matter what happens, no matter the circumstance or situation, no matter if they just came down with COVID and are lying in bed not feeling well and wondering if they're going to get over it, or they're standing on the front line in the Ukraine or on the Russian side, and they know they may not get home to see their families. For as long as they have breath, they can sustain that possibility of life being the way they need and want it to be. And it gives them the impetus, the ability, the courage to move forward and to take others along with them.
Mm-hmm. So you were describing that sort of an evolution, in a sense, of the person who's unconscious of reacting to the external stimuli of, all the good day, genius inputs, and then how that same person could be completely subsumed in the very bad, no good day inputs, and that there is a very different kind of person, the person that's aware of the inputs and also their choice in the midst of the inputs.
Right.
Like a mastery within the inputs, whether good or bad. It seems to me like the whole, I don't know if it's the hero's journey, but it seems to me the process is between those 2 points of where you think everything's happening to you and you're victim of it and you have no choice, to knowing that you have a full choice in even the most extreme circumstances.
One of the
Could you speak
guys
to
that I
that?
came across, actually before I met Roy Frazier, which kind of led me to Roy Frazier in an indirect way, was a man named Werner Erhard. Werner Erhard had developed a program called EST, the EST training. And then he also developed a secondary program that was modified a bit called Landmark Forum, which is still around today. And I had done the very last EST transition to forum program that was done by the company. And it really impacted me. And within that program, there's a comment that is made or that Werner likes to share with people. And he says, most people live at the effect of the world. The trick is to become the cause. So it's not that you don't have bad days. It's not that you don't have stuff go on that everybody has to experience in different ways and different forms that may not be what you want to happen. Right? If we're healthy and we're well and we're connected to other human beings, at some point we'll get a phone call or a letter or somebody will tell us that somebody we cared about has passed away. We have to experience that. That's part of being human. Right? The experience of that in that moment, for anybody who's had that relationship and is normally organized emotionally, is at the very, very least a sense of sadness, a sense of regret of not having that person's company and availability anymore. It could be profound grief. The difference is, how much of your life does it take over? Can you be grieving and live your life fruitfully and happily? Can you be there for others who are also grieving in a way where it alleviates their grief and doesn't deepen it? Can you hold that grief and still be content that you did know that person, you had the years with them or the months or the days, whatever it may have been, where it became significant enough that you cared when they weren't around anymore? Can you hold both of those ideas simultaneously? The sense of sadness and the sense of regret, but also the sense of the joy and thrill of having known the person who you now miss because they're no longer available and present to you. That's the difference. Is for most people, they can only be at the effect of the cause. This person has passed, and therefore the effect is I'm sad. The effect is I'm in grief. The effect is I'm incapable of recovering until next year, next month, next decade, whatever it is for that person, maybe never, right? As opposed to the person who goes, I'm sad and I'm in grief, but what a pleasure, what an opportunity, what a privilege to have known this person enough that their passing leaves me feeling a bit empty. And I know that as I continue to dwell on the memories that we had, they will once again fill this space that feels hollow now. And the sooner I do that, and the sooner I share those memories and engage with others who have other memories, as well as the memories that I have, the more that space will get filled. So let me bring a sense of joy to this moment and share the joy of having known this person, not just the sadness of having lost them. That's the difference. Now you're at cause. You're at cause of what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the extraordinary role model of Viktor Frankl that, deep in the anguish of the concentration camps, he was connected to this sense of choice and being, or he was causal.
And that I think is in fact, I'm going to call it the deep message or the profound message of Joseph Campbell's model, is that because we're living inside myths, to some extent we get to author them. And you can author the myth in a way where you change what it is. There's I won't call it a children's book, I'll call it a junior adults book by the name of Inkheart. I think it also became a movie. And in this book, what happens is these characters that are being written come to life, but they know they're characters in a book. And they have no choice but to live out the experience and who they are as the author has written them until they stop. And they take over the writing of the script they're living. And they reject.
What do you mean they stop until they stop? I didn't understand
They
that
stop
part.
living in relation to waiting for the author to write the script of what's going to happen next and what they become. And they start self-determining what happens.
They self-author.
It's a great, great little description of some aspect of the work that I did.
Yeah, that sounds like actually a summary of what you're describing, where you're a victim of, and then with the right pivot, you become self-author.
Right. And we've seen these stories over and over. It is Star Wars. It is the story of the Matrix. These stories are the stories of people who learn to script the events that they experience, not to be at the, receiving end and only the receiving end of the events they're experiencing.
So that ties to the Campbell model in that it's the process of becoming the master and returning to the world?
It ties into the Campbell model in the sense that once a person has this itch that there must be something more, life must give me more than just what's been handed to me, that there's a possibility of choice as well as to be receiving and responding, then the person is drawn to finding what Campbell refers to as the guide. Now, in all the stories, the guide is the magical master to some extent. Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Morpheus. The person who has the information you don't have that could take you to and across the threshold. And that's the guide's purpose, is simply to get you to the threshold and help you cross it. Right? And of course, the great scene in Star Wars, the threshold scene, is when they get to the bar and everything is different. All of a sudden, nothing is as it was before. There's all these creatures that Luke has never seen. He doesn't know how to interact. He almost gets himself killed. Obi-Wan Kenobi steps in and saves his life. There's this strange ethereal music. And this is this background of this scene. And we're no longer in ordinary space and time. We've gone into that space and time that, a billion stories have started with, once upon a time. Where is once upon a time in time? Is that in the future? Is that in the past? Is that outside of the line of time itself? Once upon a time is where, right? So that's where we are. We're in once upon a time. And we know that. And George Lucas gives us all the signals that we're no longer on, the farm. We're no longer digging for whatever it was that he was working for, And so the transition point is there, and you need somebody who knows how to guide that transition point, how to make sense of the transition point to take you across the threshold. I talked about in one of our conversations the idea of Tarkovsky's movie The Stalker. And this is the same thing. The stalker is the guide. He takes you across the threshold. And as soon as you get across the threshold, the guide becomes less relevant. And of course, the way George Lucas makes that obvious is he allows Obi-Wan to go away as Darth Vader kills him. Right? And in the Wachowski movie, The Matrix, Neo becomes superior to Morpheus, so Morpheus can't help him anymore. Neo has to take the lead, in fact, right? So Neo's skills, Neo's powers, let's call them, transcend Morpheus's. So the guide is no longer useful. But what happens is, once you cross the threshold, you meet what are magic helpers. And to some extent, the magic helpers may not even know they're magic helpers, right? This kid's grandfather didn't know he was a magic helper. What he knew was that he was being who he was, and this kid was watching him be that. And because of that, he performed the service of the magic helper. He performed the service of being the person that kid needed to experience to have the experience of possibility beyond what he knew to be true just for himself. Right? In Star Wars, there are a number of magic helpers. Leia is a magic helper, right? Han Solo and the Wookiee, these are magic helpers. They help him to make it through the journey that he's about to face. And what happens as a result of that is that when you meet the magic helper, you've gotten past the threshold guardians. Now, the threshold guardians are those guardians that are there that are going to try to force you back. So this is, in the movies, the guy who tries to kill Luke is making it clear, you're beyond your capability. You should not be here. And this is the same thing that happens in the movie The Matrix, where Neo is confronted with the agents, and they're basically going, you shouldn't be here. You're not ready for this, kid. Go back home. If you let us, we'll put you back into the Matrix and life will be comfortable again. It's the choice that Cypher takes in that movie, to want to go back and eat the steak even though he knows it's not real. So these are the kind of things we experience, and literature throughout the ages has done this. I could talk about Vedic scripture and Buddhist scriptures and Christian and Judaic scriptures. They all have stories like this of the magic person, Samson and Delilah, right? We see the whole story playing out, and this is what Campbell was saying, is this is not just perennial. It's what it is to be human, is to experience life in this way. And then the next thing that happens is once a person meets the magic helpers, they're ready to go to the next phase of the journey. And this is readying them to confront themselves. And after they meet the magic helper, the next people who show up are typically the monsters, the demon, the devil, the antagonist in the book, And that antagonist pretty much trails the person through the entire experience until they get the boom, until they've confronted themselves and have dealt with them. The killing of Darth Vader, that's the thing. The elimination of Smith, the agent, right? That antagonist is important to the hero because they force the hero to let go of their preconceived beliefs and to step up, to become more than they had been. Now, sometimes, by the way, in the MythoSelf work, since that's what we're talking about, my role transitions from guide to magic helper to demon. And people don't like the point where I become the demon, the one that they don't like, the one they have to fight against. But it's as important a role as being the guide that they love because it helped them across the threshold, right? And so you have to understand that the significance that each of these parts that Campbell lays out in the journey are significant. Without getting stronger, because you have to be stronger to confront the demon, you don't become stronger. And you wind up with a real chance of sliding back, you could say, or getting stuck. And one of the stories that's told about getting stuck is the story of the lotus eaters. They get trapped in eating lotus leaves, which transport them into a fantasy of absolute bliss, but they're actually, languishing away, doing nothing, and functionally dying in this trance that feels like bliss, but is rather despicable. Right? And the only way to get snapped out of that is with a relatively uncomfortable experience that forces you to leave bliss behind and deal with the realities. And the realities of life are there for us. Like I said, the tragedies, the discomforts, the pains, the aches, the setbacks. These things, when a person is at cause in their life and not at the effect of their life, are just ways that wake them up to the possibility, the potential they possess that they haven't yet realized. So that's part of the job of taking somebody through the journey, is helping them to realize their unrealized potential. And sometimes to do that, you can't do it by going, "You're wonderful. What a special person you are." The world is just all love and light. And if you just let yourself see the beauty in it, everything's going to be all right. No, it's not like that all the time. It just isn't. That isn't the human experience. Sometimes you have to look at somebody and go, you're a real shit. Now, you have a choice to not be a shit. You have a choice to get out of the bucket. But right now, you're just a turd floating aside all the other turds in the bucket. And I'm happy to leave you there if that's where you want to be. Now, I'll offer you this branch that you can climb up, but I'm not going to reach in because I don't want to be covered in shit. I'll hold the branch, you climb up it, and when you get near the top, I'm going to squirt you with a real heavy-duty hose. It's not going to feel good, by the way, because I ain't touching you and I ain't going any further with you until the shit's off you, right? So make a decision. You can float or you can climb. Nobody wants that. But I would be doing people a disservice if I wasn't willing to hold that position, if that's what they need in that moment from me as the person they're working with.
Mm-hmm. For the sake of understanding this, can we tie it back to the process you were describing with the man and his grandfather? Can you delineate again, like, what was, in what you just described, what was the relevance of the grandfather in creating this new kind of loop for this?
Grandfather is that representation, which allows him to be ready to deal with, the demon who's going to show up just ahead of him, which is the reality of the cost of his rage. And the rage isn't just there. It's not just, I have this rage. If I let it go, everything will be right. It's the cost of that rage for the 5 or 10 or 15 years he held on to it, the cost in his relationships, the lack of skills and resources he has because instead of developing them, he's been in rage, and the realization of that part of his life that's been lost. The Magic Helper helps him confront all that, to accept it as part of the reality and to get beyond it. And here I am, and I show up at that moment, going from the guide who brings him to the threshold to the demon who goes, you're a real shit who's full of rage, and you hurt the people around you. And worse than that, you hurt yourself. And it's unlikely this is going to change for you. To change it, it's going to be a shitload of work. And you're going to have to stop doing it the way you've tried to do it, which is to go to a lot of feel-good trainings and feel-good seminars and feel-good workshops and think that you can somehow sit on the floor, meditate on a candle, enter into states of bliss, and your rage will dissipate. Because as soon as the candle blows out, guess what? That rage is still there. So I have to play that role.
Yeah. So in that process, you started out as the guide. You became the Magic Helper.
I didn't become the Magic Helper in this particular case.
Okay. You utilized the grandfather as the Magic Helper. And then you became, earlier you used the word antagonist, but it's more like a provocateur. I mean, you were the agent of change at that point for him to invite him to make that self-confrontation.
Right.
That then would result.
As a provocateur, we have to be clear in I am bringing him to full presence of the discomfort. I'm making the discomfort evident and explicit in a way it probably has never been for that person. I'm pushing on the wound. The wound's full of pus. I got to get the pus out. To get the pus out, I got to press on the wound. It's going to hurt.
Wow.
Now, many people come to the MythoSelf stuff, and what they hear, because they want to, is it's all about love and light and joy and happiness and positive expectations and being positive and happiness. And ultimately, the intention is to be able to choose for that. But you can't choose for that and hang on to what you have. You can't be the monkey with its hand in the jar. The idea that the way you catch a monkey, you should take a jar that's big enough for its wrist to fit in and its hand, if its hand is relaxed, put a banana inside the jar, and when it grabs a banana, it can't pull its hand out. And if you tie the jar to a tree, when you come back, there'll be a monkey you can pick up. Because it won't let go.
And so the pus and that which is held that keeps you bound as the monkey with your hand in the jar, what is that?
It's the illusion of escape.
Illusion of escape.
Right. So for most people who enter into this kind of work with somebody like me, what happens is they go, if I was in the relationship I want to be in, everything would be great. If I had more money, my life would be perfect. If I could just buy that house on the lake, if I had a new car, if I could get my degree, when I have that new pair of shoes, it's like there's something, again, out in the world, since they live by the course of a whim, the external events of their life dictate the experience they're having. They look for the external thing that they can get that will fix everything, because they're not trying to change themselves. So they hang on to the hope, the prayer, that they'll just find the thing which will relieve all of the existential distress and discomfort if they can only get it. But the reality is, there's a great line from another movie which I love, Buckaroo Banzai. It's, everywhere I go, there I am. You can't escape yourself. Right? Mm-hmm. And, one of the less pleasant descriptions that comes out of the Zen canon is, no matter where a man goes, his buttocks and what it contains comes with him. Until you accept it, until you're as full of shit as the next person, you continue to think that when you take a crap, it smells like roses and you leave behind lotus blossoms. So one of the things that I also had to deal with in this particular guy's life, this boy I was working with at the time, and every other client I've ever worked with, is the justifications and the rationalizations and the reasons they give why what they do makes sense. Joseph, if somebody spoke to you that way, wouldn't you be angry too? If every time you tried to get ahead, the world came up and slapped you in the face and pushed you back, wouldn't you be freaking miserable? It's great for you, Joseph. You're driving a nice car and you live in a nice house. What about me? I don't have those things. Doesn't that give me the right to be depressed? And until, again, you let go of those excuses, which is what they are, those reasons for why your life is the way it is, you're not going to find a different way to operate in the world.
Can you put some words to the struggle that happens in that existential crisis, that existential distress? Literally, you're in there fighting with yourself. And, what can you say to that? You're on the other side of it. You help other people get to the other side of it. Mm-hmm. What happens there, and how do they make it to the other side of it?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to the mythic form, right? Because it's what I do. And there's these great myths that are somewhat old and, again, perennially seen. And it's interesting, sometimes they're told over and over and over again. And one of the great sources for mythology in the Western world is, in fact, the Bible. The Old Testament is a book of stories. And there are two stories that I think portray this really, really well. And both stories are the stories of somebody who has to confront themselves and realize the level at which they operate in the universe is insignificant. And until they get that, they, are not going to be able to move on. The first one is the Moses story. Moses has been chosen by God. Now, that's a pretty exalted freaking position, being chosen by God. And he's going to lead the people out of Egypt. And he's seen as the great Messiah. And he gets the people, to the Red Sea. And he gets them across the Red Sea. And now they wind up wandering in the desert. And people being people, they forget that they used to be slaves in Egypt. They forget that they were whipped every day and they had barely enough to eat. They forget that at any moment they were under the Pharaoh's thumb and he could decide the fate of their life. Because now they have a sense of freedom and they want to know where this great opportunity is. And again, they're presented with the temptation of materialism, right? The building of the golden idol. And this priest of Egypt decides he's going to lead the people to cast the golden calf. Now, God has specifically said, no graven images, right? That's one of my rules. You want to be on my side, this is my rule, and no other gods before me. But you're going to now cast the golden calf and make it a god before me. It's not going to work for you guys. And so there's revolt and mutiny in the troops. And at this point, Moses kind of doesn't know what to do, but he's called to climb Mount Sinai. And he goes up on Mount Sinai by himself. And when he gets there, if you recall the story, he's forced to his knees. And the burning cloud speaks to him, and he's freaking terrified. Now, I got to tell you, one day in Phoenix at one of these NLP conferences I talked about, and I miss a plane. So I got an extra day in Phoenix. I've never been to Sedona. And everybody's going, Sedona, Sedona, Sedona. You got to get to Sedona. It's Sedona. Okay, I got to see Sedona. So I rent a car, and the car company gives me a Mustang convertible. So I drive up to Sedona, which is a beautiful place, red rock cliffs. I mean, it was really fun. The town is just like this leftover 1960 hippieville. It was just really cool. And it's beautiful, really beautiful. One of my favorite people in the world is Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright built a church that's right on one of the cliffs in Sedona. And it's just these beautiful things. And I was in a magical space. I was in, again, Middle Earth for a little while. And now I'm driving home. I got to drive home to the hotel in this particular case to catch the plane the next morning. And I'm going to sleep in the hotel. And so I leave and it's dark. It's now nighttime. And I'm fundamentally in the Arizona desert. Now, I've never been in the desert before like this. And somehow, I don't know why, I wind up looking up above the windshield. The roof is down on the car. It's beautiful. The weather's perfect at night there. And I see stars like I've never seen stars in my life. I'm now looking at the Milky Way, and I understand what the Milky Way looks like with the naked eye. I can see it. It's cloudless. The air is clear. The piece of road I'm on, there are no lights. So the sky is dark, and literally you can see every star, that God put in heaven. And so I pull over in the service area. There's a service area where you can rest. It was mostly built for truckers. And it's on a cliff up above the highway. So I drive up into the service area. There's nobody there. It's pitch black. I get out of my car, and I lay on the hood of my car. And I stare at these clouds for a while. And in that moment, there was 3 or 4 things that happened. I was having an epiphany of the wonder, the magnificence, the enormity of the universe. And I was overwhelmed. It was an ecstatic moment. At the same time, I am less than a grain of sand. In the face of the Milky Way, if you can hold in your mind that you're dust, you have a magnificent sense of self, right? So it's the sense of being part of something that's enormous and magnificent that contains me, and a sense of utter insignificance. I recognize in an instant my being in the scope of eternity, other than maybe to me, is irrelevant. And at the same time, this thing that I'm experiencing, the context of being part of the cosmos, would be a different cosmos if I weren't present in it. My being in it shapes it to some extent. And I'm having these waves of ecstasy, realizing this and insignificance. And then I hear this howling off in the distance, and I figure, probably time to get off the hood of the car and get back in the car and drive my butt down. So I do. And I imagine for Moses, there must have been something like this, that God has chosen him, and it chooses to appear before him in the burning cloud. And at the same time, in the presence of what God is, and what he realizes God is, he's insignificant. So he falls to his knees, and he's trembling. And Moses is not the world's best orator. And God gives him the tablets with the commandments and tells him, go and give these to the people. And Moses is like, how could I possibly be expected to go down to the people and tell them I met God and God gave me the tablets? Which eventually obviously get put in the Ark of the Covenant, right? And he says, tell me who I should tell them you are. If you tell me your name, the name of God has been the great mystery, they will believe me. And the way it's written in the Bible, at least translated to English, is, tell them, Moses, that I am that I am. Now, beautiful. The translation is in Aramaic. Depending on how you interpret that, because of the nature of verb tenses in the Aramaic, you can interpret it to read, Tell them I am that which I am becoming. Which to me, when I read that and read the Aramaic scholar who suggested it, it was a complete revision of my understanding of God's presence to Moses. God transcends all time and space. Tell them I am in this moment already that which I am becoming. Right? What a great message. What a message to be able to offer people. And to some extent, what I try to share with them is, in fact, the gift of being born. In the same way that an acorn is an oak tree, you are that which you are becoming. So Moses goes down and he presents himself to the people, but the story goes on to say, in that moment, Moses is filled with the light of God, so much so that to look upon him would blind anyone. So he has to cover his face with a veil. This story gets repeated again in the story of Jonah. Jonah's out in the ocean. He gets swallowed by a whale. In comparison to the whale, he's a piece of flotsam. And he lives in the whale's stomach for a while until he figures out how to get out, which is to use these other pieces of flotsam and to somehow light a fire. And the fire and the heat, the smoke, cause the whale to open his mouth and cough and spit him out. And he survives. But when he comes out, he's bleached pure white. His imperfections have been washed from him. Right? This is the thing. In the presence of God's fire burning away all the impurities, you shine with a light that would blind others. After facing yourself and realizing you're simply flotsam in the stomach of the whale, you come out and you've been bleached white. Your impurities have been bleached away. This is the moment in the journey where you go into the cave, as Luke did, and he kills Darth Vader, and the mask opens, and he sees his own face. Right? This is where Neo realizes that in the moment he looks at the agent, he is the agent. And this idea of confronting yourself as the best and worst of all things, as representing the totality of the cosmos, and at the same time, the insignificance of what it is that contains you, right? And ultimately, we know Neo submits himself to, the machine as a sacrifice to save the people. He's the Messiah story. You only can do that if you accept your insignificance. You have to let go. You have to submit. And so the point of going into the cave or going into the tunnel or looking in the mirror is to see what's there, to see yourself without any mask at all. And you see all of the good and all of the bad. You see the warts as well as the beauty. And if you can accept that, if you can embrace that thing that you are, the magnificence of being part of something that is much greater than you could ever contain, and yet influencing that which contains you, and also hold those two ideas in mind simultaneously, then you've achieved the freedom from the existential angst and crisis about what it is you're supposed to be or who you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to do. You have tremendous freedom at that moment. You are ready to receive the boon. And the boon is always, regardless of how it's described, the coming to know yourself as you are.
So first, the willingness to see yourself fully naked, as you said, warts and all, then takes you to the place of knowing yourself fully as well.
Right. So this is the polar position of hubris and humility. And in that moment, it's making the choice. And we've been conditioned and taught almost from birth to hold hubris as the preferred position, when in fact the only choice that frees us is humility. But to be humble doesn't mean to be impotent. To be humble doesn't mean to be submissive in a way that you have no volition, that you have no ability to affect the outcomes of your life. It means to recognize, even when you will fail, acting at your best is enough.
You're describing a very powerful process. You're describing the full circle of the hero's journey. And it's at once mythological, and it's also, when it's like, when someone's willing to go through it, it's the most visceral human experience you could have. So what I'm asking is this the change work that you do, the transformational work that you do with people in the MythoSelf process?
Yeah. And then once they've received that message and accept it, embody it, to integrate it, then the next step in the process is to help them take that back into their daily life. Because one of the challenges is it would be very easy from that position to fall back into hubris. Think of yourself as a god. Mm-hmm. So you have to help them cross the threshold back into their ordinary awareness while they can hold that disparate, oppositional form of being nothing and everything.
Mm-hmm. And also you described that people can taste this, they can touch it, they can reach it for a time, and then they can also slide
That's
out
right.
of it. What's that about?
Life comes up. What that's about is that life comes up. So again, if the only time you can have it being perfect is when the person you made love to last night is in the kitchen cooking you breakfast, you have a very limited window of perfection. If you can be perfect when your 9 employees are staring at you, waiting for you to perform, and everything up until that moment has gone as wrong as it could, and you're unaffected by it, then you've transitioned, you've transformed into something else. And you're not standing in front of them as a god, booming down into them the message that you've come prepared to deliver. You're standing there with a sense of humility that gives you tremendous vulnerability and transparency, but simultaneously, tremendous power.
I'm thinking of the phrase, in the world, but not of it, mm-hmm. or the final scene where Neo's in the Matrix, but he's able to, basically transport himself in and out of it freely.
One of my favorite stories is from the Indian Vedic scriptures of Arjuna. And Arjuna is the greatest warrior of his age. And there's now a battle that's going to be had. And the battlefield is prepared. And on the battlefield it's said that brothers will fight brothers and fathers will fight sons. And Arjuna is literally facing uncles and cousins and brothers on the other side. And he's despairing because he says, how can I do this? How can I be an instrument of death to these people that I love? And he's with his charioteer. And his charioteer is dragging him around and showing him the field of battle. And they're having a conversation, a very philosophical conversation. And it turns out that the charioteer is actually Krishna. And at some point he begs Krishna to show him the field of battle through the eyes of the gods. And so Krishna removes the veil from his eyes, and he sees what gods see. And he immediately begins begging Krishna again to take it away and put the veil back because it's overwhelming. He can't deal with it. This is Moses before the burning cloud turning his head away. Right? This is Noah, rather, in the belly of the whale in pure darkness, unable to see. This is what happens. It's the realization that it's not our place to see what the gods see. And Krishna says to him in those moments, what makes you think for a second that your choices will influence the will of the gods? The fate of these men has already been decided. He says, go and do your duty. You're a warrior. Be a warrior. Go and do your duty. The best modern interpretation, in my opinion, of that scene is in the what the heck is it called? The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. And of course, he gets caught. He's brought in as a prisoner. He's basically reborn, if you want to call it that, in the hands of this last samurai, who takes him in almost like a son. And he develops almost a filial loyalty to this guy and becomes a samurai. And he goes into the field of battle knowing that literally everyone he's with is going to die. He expects to die. He's going with samurai swords against a Gatling gun. He's been a soldier who's used Gatling guns. He knows what they do. He knows that these people will not make it. But the samurai he's loyal to also knows this and says it doesn't matter. We need the emperor to see what loyalty looks like. We need the emperor to remember honor. And somehow Tom Cruise lives, throughout the scene, makes it past that horrible battle. Everyone around him dies, including, his savior, his benefactor. And in the moment of the benefactor's death, the benefactor, his whole life, adult life that we're given, has been meditating on the cherry blossoms. And he's been hoping to see the perfect cherry blossom. This will transport him beyond human awareness into some state of nirvana, samadhi. And as he's dying, he looks, and it happens to be a scene in which the wind blows and the cherry blossoms around him are all falling to the ground. And he makes this comment, perfect, all perfect. And he realizes that there is no such thing as a cherry blossom that's less than perfect being what it is, as it is, in whatever form or shape it takes. And then he asks Tom Cruise to please kill him so he can pass in honor. Tom Cruise has now reached a point where he realizes this is his duty, to kill the man he probably loves more than any other person on the planet. And he takes up his duty, lifts his sword and kills him. See, this is humility.
Mm-hmm. Extraordinary.
So we have all the examples around us. It's not like we don't have the source material to go to understand how to reform the myth. It's not like we don't understand how to step into the myth and be present to it. It's just that society, the relationships we have, our personal aspirations and desire tend to want to pull us away from and drag us away from the reality of the possibility of being in relation to the pure mythological form that is our birthright. And if we can let go of everything that's been installed in us and imposed upon us, even for a moment, we can come to that secondary realization, that instantaneous awareness of perfection. And as long as we have that memory even once in our life as an adult, it becomes the source that we can go to whenever we need or want to renew ourselves to the position we can hold, which makes all of life magnificent, releases the totality of our potential, so we can step forward into our future uninhibited.
And it seems like a very, very long and complex journey. At the same time, it could happen in an instant.
The event itself happens always in an instant. Then it's conditioning and practice to hold it. I'll tell you one more story, and I think we probably covered the ground today. There's a book by a guy named Richard Marcinko called Rogue Warrior. Richard Marcinko is a real guy, and I think he's created a narrative which is larger than life, of his own life. But he tells a story, and he was truly a U.S. Navy SEAL. He was a bad guy, and he grew up doing not nice things as a kid, and enters the Navy, winds up getting into the SEALs, becoming part of a SEAL unit. He goes through officer training school, becomes an officer, a commander, and he's asked to take over a SEAL team. And this is the first SEAL team that was specifically designed to be a counter-terrorist unit. Now, at the time, there's only 3 SEAL teams, but they refer to his team as SEAL Team 6 to confuse the enemy. As von Clausewitz said, all war is deception, quoting, Musashi Matsumoto. And he realizes that he's going to take over this team, and they have to be the best trained soldiers in the world. So he designs a protocol, and I could go into depth about it. He lays it out very, very specifically in the book of how he trains his soldiers to be the best shooters in the world. And he basically says, in order to do that, they had to fire 1,000 rounds a day. The Navy at some point comes back and goes, do you know how much ammunition costs? We're not giving you 1,000 rounds a day anymore. You've been blowing through ammunition like a madman. It's expensive. And he says, okay. And he does a kind of expert shooter test with his soldiers. And he submits it. And then he backs them off to, I think, 250 rounds a day from 1,000 rounds a day. And then redoes all the tests. And they come back at 50% or something like that of the efficiency and effectiveness. And this is what people don't understand. Even though these people are capable, they're the most capable shooters in the world, without that daily, intensive commitment and practice, they lose the edge. Mm-hmm. So you have to decide, how badly do you want to keep the edge once you find it? Mm-hmm. And what...
I'm getting the image of, like, the having to keep your knife
right.
sharp. To keep
the old Abraham Lincoln thing. If he was challenged to a contest to cut down a tree, and he was given an hour to do it, he would spend 15 minutes sharpening his axe. Right. So these are the kind of things that you look at. And again, these stories are out there. They're overwhelming. There's, I don't know how many of them, for all intent and purpose from a human scale, an innumerable number of them. And the only thing I would add that I think would be useful at this point is everybody has to remember that despite all of the magnificence of the possibility we're discussing, we're each and every one of us human. And we'll experience all the limitations of what it is to be human. And two of the most devastating things that will take you off the path, in addition to all of the emotional pulls and draws and complications, is when we're tired and when we're hungry, we lose resourcefulness. Now we can practice dealing with tiredness, and we can practice dealing with hunger, and we can transcend them to a point. But the best rule of thumb is, when you're tired, sleep, and when you're hungry, eat. Don't make big decisions.
Very practical. Very somatic. Take care of the vehicle.
Take care of the vehicle. Sharpen your sword. Keep it well oiled. When it's rusty, it doesn't work as well. And when you notice rust before you go to battle, polish your sword.
I guess I would ask maybe a parting question, which is, how does this tie into the phrase I've heard you use, becoming fully human?
Well, the thing is that we're all born fully human. And the humanity that we're born with is stripped away from us by, again, a number and a constant cycle of sensitizing imprints. We're experiencing our magnificence, and it gets interrupted. It gets interrupted with no maliciousness, just because it's time to eat dinner, and the fascination you have with the rain puddle you're playing in is interrupted by your parents calling you in to have dinner. And it breaks that sense of magnificence. It breaks that sense of fascination. It breaks the sense of ecstasy you were in just a moment before. And eventually, when this happens 1,000 times, you start losing the belief that ecstasy, that transcendent awareness is possible to contain and to continue. You begin to submit and give into the needs of others for you to be who they need you to be so that they can be at peace. And so the process, as much as anything, is remembering who you've always been while you let go of who you decided you have to be accepted by others. And so you regain your humanness by claiming it. You regain your humanness by letting go of all the expectations that have been placed upon you and which you've begun to integrate and assimilate as though they're your own. So as soon as you lack aspiration to be anything other than what you are, again, warts and all, zaniness, quirkiness, weirdness, uniqueness, idiosyncratic behaviors, all of those things that we each have, and accept that that's just who we are. And it's not just okay, it's necessary for us to experience the perfection that the samurai experience in the falling of the cherry blossoms. Even the ones that were bent and crooked, the ones that had begun to decay a bit, they were all perfect. We're all perfect. Mm-hmm. And that belief is one of the hardest beliefs to get someone to accept about themselves. But when you do, you've regained your humanness. Now, the difference is that you'll be a different human, and you'll be, in a way, more fully human than you were when you were born, because in birth, there's no choice but to be in a state of dependency. We can't make it outside of the womb in the first year or two. In the world in which we live, we can't make it on our own at least until about the age of 10 or 12, and society tells us we're not ready to make it and won't let us until we're 18 or 20. And by then, we've been completely shaped to fit into the pattern that society desires us to have, not the pattern that we are. But when you come out the other side, not only do you have all of that, the pattern that you are intact, that's never left you, but all of the learning that you've accumulated along the way of how the world is shaped and how by choice you can fit into it when and where and how you like, and how you can disregard all the pressure, all the intention that others have to reform you, to mold you, to reshape you into the desires they need you to be so that they can be comfortable in their own distorted mechanisms, in their own distorted form. See, because every time you do this, think about this for a moment. If you're surrounded by 100 people who have not experienced the conversation we're having and gone through the process I'm describing, the only way for them to justify retaining their own distortions is to be in a group of others who are at least equally distorted to themselves.
And also to be threatened by the person that won't participate in the distortion.
The person who has regained themselves is an insult to them.
Or, the biggest threatening reminder of what they're choosing versus what they could choose.
Yeah, I mean, the person who's regained himself and is living as a fully human, realized human being, for the person who hasn't, is the equivalent of staring into the abyss. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a very personal story, and I really think it's the last thing I would want to say. And it's, I'm going through this process of learning with Roy, somewhere in the midst of that deep apprenticeship. And of course, my mind and consciousness is subsumed with the learning process, with everything that's becoming present for me, that I'm becoming aware of. And I literally woke up one night out of a deep sleep. It's the middle of the night, middle of my sleep. And there's this kind of resounding little phrase, I guess you'd call it, almost like a poetic stanza, that I come out of whatever it was, the dream state, the deep sleep I was in. And it's the only thing I remember from whatever I had been dreaming. And it was this phrase, this poetic thing that lingered, which was, I am perched on the branch of chaos, staring into the abyss of reality. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know where that phrase came from. But in that moment, at least, it made great sense to me.
Well, let's continue staring into the abyss of reality. While still holding the branch of chaos. And resting when we're tired and eating when we're hungry.
If you took away only one thing, that would be useful.
Wonderful. This conversation is extremely useful, and I hope that it will be useful for many others. And I look forward to further deep dives into the multifaceted elements that we've touched upon here today.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Ci vediamo.
Vediamo.
Is that right?
Buona fortuna e abbondanza.
Ci vediamo.
Buona fortuna, good fortune, Abbondanza,
Good fortune.
abundance.
Thank you.